Morning. The scripture this morning is taken from the Paul's letter to Romans, and it's found in chapter 10, verses 1 to 15, and I'll be reading from the NIV. Now, the letter that Paul wrote to the Romans was a bit unique in that he had never visited Rome up to that point in his career. And so even though he hadn't met them, he begins, "Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, for their zeal is not based on knowledge. Since they did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. Christ is the culmination of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. Moses writes this about the righteousness that is by the law. The person who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that is by faith says, 'Do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven?' That is to bring Christ down. Or, who will descend into the deep? That is, to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the message concerning faith that we proclaim. If you declare with your mouth, 'Lord, Jesus is Lord,' and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. As the scripture says, anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame, for there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all, and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, 'How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news.'" May God add a blessing and understanding to this reading from his holy word.
Well, good morning, everyone. As Pastor Scott mentioned, my name is Derek. I'm the youth pastor here. I'm going to be preaching today and next Sunday as well. For those of you who might be a bit like myself and can overthink things sometimes, don't overthink things with Scott. There was 2 pastors here, and I think it's fair for the youth pastor to have a shot at the pulpit from every now and then. He's okay. Be in prayer for him always, but especially these next couple of weeks as he takes a bit of a change of routine from his week-to-week preaching and is perhaps thinking a bit of bigger scale in the life of the church. And of course, I'm excited and grateful to have the opportunity to share with you. It's one thing to share with youth on Tuesday night, but you never quite know what kind of back and forth there might be in that environment. And I guess you also never know on a Sunday morning what kind of back and forth there would be, but it kind of feels a little bit more predictable what I might be facing on a Sunday morning. Have any of you guys ever heard of or done a spiritual gift test? Now, I know that this is kind of, I say that I am looking forward to not receiving feedback, but then I just ask you a question. But I don't know if you're allowed to do this on a Sunday morning, but I'll do it anyways. But you can, if you've ever heard of or done a spiritual gift test, can you just perhaps raise your hand? Okay, that's good. My biggest fear is that no one would have done one. Then I'd have to come up with a new sermon on the fly. But I saw about 20-ish hands, so that's good. I'm honestly not even really sure what to think of them. I think some of them seem to be good and helpful. Some of them haven't seemed to be super helpful. But regardless, if you are a Christian, I think it's important that you know some of the ways in which God has gifted you and how you can best utilize those gifts to help build up those in God's kingdom. Something consistent that I've seen whenever I do one of these spiritual gift tests is that one of the gifts God has given me is the gift of evangelism. Now, those of you who know me well and are kind of familiar with certain spiritual gifts and the gift of evangelism, you might be thinking to yourself, well, Derek doesn't seem like the prototypical person to have the gift of evangelism. Given how, if you think of that word and then you consider perhaps my laid-back personality, it doesn't seem to fit with the typical style of the American street evangelist. But the word evangelism is one of many words that we will come across in our Bibles, perhaps as we go about and do life in the church. But I think it's one of those words that before we perhaps throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, I think it's one that we need to reconsider before we decide to just throw it out. So evangelism, I think, simply means us sharing the good news of Jesus with the world around us. That's what evangelism is. A popular Christian figure in the 1200s named St. Francis of Assisi has been credited by saying, "Preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words." I think this addresses a common problem, that our preaching sometimes forgets to include good actions, but I also think it creates a sort of a false dichotomy between word and deed. Preaching the gospel, while yes, is a verbal act, it has always been meant to be accompanied by loving deeds. From what I gather, to be fair to St. Francis, he's had his words mistranslated over the years, it seems, and never actually meant to create this false dichotomy between our words and our deeds. But what still holds true with this idea, however, is that our verbal preaching of the gospel, or evangelism, should always be paired with good deeds. They're meant to go together. Often when I think of this word evangelism, I think of angry Christians in busy street corners trying to win arguments by loudly shouting their knowledge over others. But listen to what Jesus says to his disciples when he's about to send them out to share his good news with those around them. He says in Matthew 10, verse 19, "Do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time, you will be given what to say." A lot of my preparation for this morning and for next week's mini-series came from reading a book, and now as I'm reading this, I was supposed to bring the book up here so I could show it to you, but I didn't bring it with me. But I've been reading this book called How to Tell the Truth, the story of how God saved me to win not just arguments, but to win hearts. And the author is, the man of the author, his name is Preston Perry. On page 35, he says that God did not give us his Spirit so that we can study and pour into people what we know. He gave us his Spirit so that he can speak through us. See, the goal of the evangelist isn't just to prove to others that we know more than they do. The goal of the evangelist is to help open others' hearts to receive the call that God has placed on their life. I know that these next 2 weeks were the kind of the topic that I want to focus on is evangelism, but the reality about the passage that Wayne just read for us is that Paul, when he writes to the Romans, a lot of what he's dealing with is the topic of salvation. And it's not until the last few verses where he encourages us what to do with it. And I wanted to spend a good chunk of this morning in this passage dealing with salvation because before we can have a good understanding of the concept of evangelism, we first need to have a good understanding of salvation. So this word saved, if you're listening to the scripture and paying attention, you would have noticed that it was actually mentioned, the word saved was mentioned 4 times alone in just that passage. Paul's prayer for the Israelites is that they might be saved. I remember Pastor Scott mentioning one Sunday that a term that Christians can be called is people of the book. So if we're going to be people of the book, that is the Bible, we need to become familiar with some of the terminology in it, even if some of the words aren't things that we may hear or use a lot in our culture today. I think it's important that we familiarize ourselves with the words that are in this book, and that even some of them, even if they might feel a little bit out of place in our culture, that we can adopt them for ourselves. First, I want to talk about the first 8 or so verses in Romans 10, specifically where Paul says to the Romans that the righteousness that is by faith says, "Do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the deep, that is to bring Christ up from the dead." But what does it say? The word is near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the message concerning the faith that we proclaim. Paul is writing to the Christians in Romans who, for the first time in history, are dealing with the reality that God's salvation has extended from one nation, that being ancient Israel, and has now been extended to the whole world. So much of Paul's writings in the New Testament have to do with this distinction between the Jews and the Gentiles, which might not be as familiar with us today. But this is because for the people Paul is interacting with, salvation for many, many centuries was only thing as something that was for the Jews. But they missed the fact that God's plan from the beginning, his plan of salvation wasn't just for the Jews. It wasn't made just for Israel, but his plan of salvation was made for the world. And Israel was just meant to be the medium by which God would bring his plan of salvation throughout the earth. So much of what these Jewish believers are saying is that if outsiders are going to be brought into God's salvation, what must they do to earn it? And Paul's response to them here is that they actually don't have to do anything to earn their salvation. Should they ascend into heaven? No, because Christ already came down from heaven. Should they descend to the deep? Also no, because Christ already defeated death. Jesus has done the work of salvation, and that's why Paul says in verse 13 that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. End of sentence. So, when we say that God saved us, I want us to consider what exactly is it that means? What is it that we're saying? Because I think it's a term that we can throw around quite loosely in churches, but to actually understand what it is we're saying, I think there's a lot of weight behind that. Because this word saved has many facets in the word, and often we can have a tendency to water it down and just see it on this kind of two-dimensional plane. But I think there's a lot to unpack with the word saved. So first of all, when God saved us, we're not only talking about the fact that God saves individual people. Jesus actually saved an entire world, a world that was heading towards death. But by sending Jesus to earth, God was inaugurating his own kingdom here on earth. But when we think about salvation from an individual perspective, what does it actually mean? What does it mean when we say that we are saved? First of all, it means that we are saved from the penalty of sin. I said at youth group a few weeks ago, I'll say it again here, it's kind of an awkward thing to consider, especially at a youth group, but it means that the reality is that all roads eventually lead to death. This means that everything in life, even the things that seem good, that seem promising, eventually come to an end. There's no getting around it. And the things that we think will lead to a life of fulfillment will eventually leave us broken and disappointed. I'm sorry to say, but the result of sin and human rebellion has left us with a penalty that we simply can't avoid, which is death, eternal separation from God. But through Jesus' death and resurrection, God made a way for us to be saved. Through personal belief in Jesus and the work that he accomplished on the cross, the penalty that was ours, through Jesus, has been taken away. We've been given new identities, and what was once a broken relationship with God has now been saved. So we are saved from the penalty of sin. And we're also saved from the power of sin. Paul says in Romans, the same book, chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, he says that, "For we know that our old self was crucified with him so that the body ruled by sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin, because the one who died has been set free from sin." Salvation is not just this thing that we wait for at the end of our lives. It's also something that we can experience now. We know that through Jesus' sacrificial death, we are also given his Spirit and are enabled to make choices that aren't governed by the power of sin. We are free to make choices that give life and that point to the reality that Jesus has begun the work of a new creation. To refer to the analogy that Pastor Scott used a few weeks ago, to say that we are saved from the power of sin is something like saying that we've been given new clothes to wear. While from time to time we may be tempted to put on the old, worn-out, and ragged clothes, God has enabled us to put on new clothes, which over time, as we continue to wear them, will begin to fit us well. So in the same way, by immersing ourselves in the Bible and resting on Jesus, the one who saved us from the penalty of sin, we can also trust that he saved us from the power of sin, and our life patterns will begin to look more and more, excuse me, hopefully that won't continue, more and more like the ones that Jesus demonstrates. So we know that we are saved from something, the penalty and the power of sin, but the piece of salvation that I think is most prone to being overlooked is the fact that we're also saved for something. And that's where this series topic of evangelism comes in. Because while, yes, we are saved from sin, we are also saved for the work of sharing the gospel. We are saved for the work of evangelism and sharing our faith. At the end of the passage that Wayne read for us, the Apostle Paul says to the Roman church, "How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them?" This tells us that evangelism isn't just something we leave for those who have it as a gift. Evangelism isn't simply just meant for the person who is an evangelist. Evangelism is simply, it's a requirement for all Christians. It's just a part of, sharing our faith is a part of what it means for us to be a Christian. And the Apostle Paul makes it clear that if people are going to receive the message of salvation, it must also be brought to them. Now, I know there's instances where people have perhaps received dreams or visions from God, but I also recognize that this isn't the norm, and that we can't just depend for everyone to hear the news of Jesus, to hear the story of salvation, and just depend that God is going to somehow share with them who he is. Because the primary way in which people come to learn of Jesus, to learn of our faith, is through us sharing the message of Jesus with them. I often hear, our culture telling us that it's okay to have religious beliefs as long as, you don't shove them down people's throats, which I absolutely agree with. But, if you have a religious belief, keep it to yourself. The problem with this, however, is that I mentioned earlier, is that sharing our beliefs, sharing our faith in Jesus is inherently a piece of what it is, of what makes us Christian. God didn't save us so that we would no longer have to deal with others. We could just hide off in our bedrooms or the places where we feel safe. But God saved us so that we could spread the news of his salvation throughout the earth. I think we sometimes wish our relationship with Jesus could just be kept private, or at least between a close circle of friends and family. And the idea of sharing our faith with others is a bit daunting. But what I want to suggest to us is that evangelism is something that, yes, sometimes can feel a bit daunting, but the reality of it is that it's an opportunity. And yes, there are many people who have done a poor job of it, but we shouldn't allow them to be the ones who define what it looks like for us. We often think of, evangelism as fearlessly approaching a stranger to share your faith, however that might look like. But something else that the author Preston Perry says in his book is that evangelism is more about being bold before God. More about being bold before God than being fearless before people. He shares a story which I think illustrates this quite well. While he and his wife were waiting for their flight at an airport, they had about 45 minutes until their plane was boarding. So Preston, the author, in many ways meets this stereotype of the typical evangelist. He's an extrovert. He loves talking, approaching strangers, and just seems to have no social fear whatsoever. And it's something that seems to come natural to him. But his wife, on the other hand, is quite a bit different. She's an introvert. She prefers keeping to herself most of the time. But to be an evangelist doesn't just mean you have to be someone who regularly goes up to strangers and tells them about Jesus. While they were waiting for their flight in the airport, Preston noticed a group of Jehovah's Witnesses at a nearby gate. So instinctively to him, he told his wife that he was going to go talk to these people and share the gospel. And of course, his wife, wanting no part in it, she told him that she was going to go find a nearby restaurant and get some food and wait for them and wait for him to finish up. After Preston finished sharing the gospel with these Jehovah's Witnesses, and the book actually doesn't say how that conversation went, he went to find his wife praying with the waitress at the nearby restaurant. When he asked her, how did this happen? How did this come about? She said that the waitress asked her when she went to the restaurant by herself. She said, where is your husband? When she told her that he was over by another gate talking to some Jehovah's Witnesses, she opened up about how she had also been brought up Jehovah's Witness. But because she went against some of their rules, she had then been excommunicated by her friends, her community, and her family. And after talking for a while, Jackie, the name of Preston's wife, then shared how Jesus has been, for all these years, has been mourning alongside of her, and how he accepts her. He's not, his salvation for her isn't dependent on the choices she's made in her past, but he's been with her, been mourning alongside of her, and accepts her and offers her a new life where she's at. She then offered to pray for her, and that's, of course, when her husband showed up. The reality is that God made each of us unique. Some of us, like Preston, with extroverted tendencies who enjoy starting up, conversations with strangers, with whoever. While others of us, he might have created more like Jackie with more introverted tendencies and who naturally want to keep to themselves. And one of these is not better than the other. Evangelism is more about being bold before God than it is about being fearless towards people. So as we go, and I'll invite Jane and the choir up here momentarily, but as we go, would we remember that our mission is to continually remember the salvation that Jesus has brought to us through his death on the cross, and that we are invited to share the gift of salvation with the world through evangelism with a posture of boldness before God.